Hi, social work students. Welcome to week 13 in History and Policy, Social Work 250. Wow, week 13. We are moving right along here. This week we're going to talk quite a bit about vulnerable populations. Some of the terms that you're going to need to be familiar with include discrimination and oppression. And let's start out just by identifying those terms and defining them. First of all, discrimination is making a difference in treatment or favor on a basis other than individual merit. So how would that apply to you as a social worker? If you have a client who you might be likely to discriminate against, why would that be? And this is a time while you're studying to look internally at what your own definitions of minority is and why you would be willing to discriminate against someone. And maybe it's someone who belongs to a group of people who you have had problems with in the past. Maybe you have unresolved issues with a certain demographic. I knew one social worker who had unresolved issues with men, and she was female, and so it was very difficult for her to work with adult males until she was able to see them as people who had in their own right developed from a child, and she could see them from that perspective, and that helped it be a little more clear to her not to discriminate against them. Oppression is another term you need to be really familiar with. What does it mean what does oppression mean? And according to your textbook, oppression fuses institutional and systemic discrimination. Okay, so fuses, it puts together both institutional and systemic discrimination. So institutions systemically discriminate personal bias, bigotry, and social prejudice in a complex web of relationships and structures that saturate most aspects of our life in our society. As social workers, we fight against oppression, and we should be a safe place for anybody to come to. There are some categories in our society who are more protected because of race or national origin or gender or religion or age or their ability. And so the protected individuals are different from the more vulnerable populations. What are some of the more vulnerable subgroups in the U.S. population? To identify those, it's pretty cut and dried. People of color, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgendered individuals, children, women, the aged, and working Americans. These are all subgroups that we see. Because of the coronavirus, we see just how vulnerable these populations are and just how easy it is to pull the rug out from beneath people and have them really in a desperate situation. Let's talk a little bit about what you're reading in Chapter 10 about people of color and the social construction of race. So the biological construction of race means, what a person's DNA is, what they have inherited from their predecessors. And it used to be that we identified people of color by a biological construction. What's interesting is that is not always the case for a lot of the Native American communities. I talked to one history professor who helped me understand that in a lot of Native American cultures, deciding who was Native American had nothing to do with blood quantum. It had to do with the social construction. If you had been a part of that tribe from the time you were a child, you were considered Native American. And so understanding the difference between biological versus social construction is a very important part of what you need to know this week in your studying. Let's talk about race and ethnicity. So there's different theories out there about racism. According to your textbook, it is a fundamental lens through which members of privileged groups view the world. It incorporates beliefs that justify racial oppression. So racism has to do with ignorance. it has to do with market theories. It has to do with class conflict. And we're going to talk a little bit about unpacking your backpack of privilege and what that means in a little bit. Please be sure to read and understand the role of government and how that plays into our understanding of racism and how public policy plays into racism. There is in your PowerPoint this week for it's listed as chapter 9, but it's actually in your textbook chapter 10. There is a graph which shows our racial composition in the U.S. population and how it has changed from the year 1990 and how it's projected to change up to the year 2050. So according to this graph, by the year 2050, there will be more Hispanic and Latino than there will be white people. There will be more African Americans than white people. And I think that's really important to recognize that if you feel like you're in the minority group right now, it could be that later you'll be part of the majority and vice versa. I think it's really important that as social workers, you study our history. You really understand where we come from. We come from a people who actually allowed slavery to happen. And it still goes on. The slave trade continues to be active. The state of Nevada, we trade places with Louisiana in being number one in the most children in the sex slave trade. So that's pretty embarrassing and pretty horrific, but guess what? It means job security for social workers. But the slavery that happened up until the 1860s, when the Civil War helped us do away with it, is a part of our culture even today. For several years, I lived in East Cleveland, and I was a minority there. I was one of the few white people. Now, I do have some Native American ancestry, but I was among one of the only white people in my neighborhood. It was a really great experience for me, but I also came to recognize how we have evolved sociologically, how we have evolved as a culture from slavery. And there's a lot of sad things that have happened because of that. There's a lot of layover attitudes in parenting among African Americans. And I have a lot of really good friends in inner cities who are African Americans. And one of the things that I learned in living in inner cities, particularly in East Cleveland, was that a lot of the women were more likely to be in the African American culture. Women tend to be the matriarch of the family. It's more of a matriarchal culture. And from my reading, I've come to recognize that part of that is because if a child acted up for the slave master, he could be put to death. A mother had to teach a child to suppress their natural nature, their natural outgoingness. And so the propensity to actually beat children is something that's been handed down from the slave culture, where if a mother didn't beat her child, he could be beaten to death by the master. And so that's kind of an interesting aftermath of slavery that we still see today, where there's among some African American families, it comes more naturally to have physical abuse going on in families. Well, that's what kept them safe in the slave culture. We come from a culture where there was segregated schools, where white children and black children were not allowed to study together, where black children were thought of, people of color were thought of not as human beings. And I'm reading a wonderful book right now called Indian Horse, which tells the story of the Canadian schools for Native American children. It's horrific. It's horrible. but I'm learning a lot. And I think it's important that we as social workers really understand where a lot of the attitudes are coming from, the attitudes of horror from people of color, who that this attitudes have been passed down through generations, and rightly so. I'm grateful that I come from a background of Quakers, and luckily I can say that my white ancestors were part of the of helping people. They were people who helped with the Underground Railroad in getting African American people to safety. My Native American great grandmother would feed the other natives as they passed by on their way to wipe out the white people. And so, anyway, recognizing that, you know, we're a melting pot and we need to be more accepting of each other. We've come a long way, and a lot of my students, you know, when you write papers, I see positive attitudes towards other races, and I love that. I think that's great. But in rural Nevada especially, I think we have to be the leaders in having a positive attitude that way. Another thing to be aware of in our history is that convict leasing was definitely something that happened in our background. And this was where, so people of color to this day are more likely to be convicted and be in prison. And we come from a history where these people were leased out for slave labor, even after slavery was so-called done away with. And so be aware of all of these different concepts that are in your textbook. Some of the current realities for people of color. Progress. We've seen significant progress, but we continue to see disadvantage. I think progress includes having a president of the United States who was a person of color. But we continue to see disadvantage. For example, there still is a lower household income, and there are more women who head households among people of color. There are higher rates of policy. There are lower educational attainment, there's more health disparities, and I'm sure you're aware right now people of color are more likely to die from coronavirus. I mean, I think that's a scary thing right now. We have an increased infant mortality, and the occupational distribution is unfair. I saw in my own agency teaching domestic violence programs, I was more likely to see people of color come into my classes. There was an unfair distribution of people of color. If you looked at the population of people in Elko, Nevada, and how many people of color were court ordered into my classes, there was a disparity. So we need to work at changing that. Hispanic Americans. There are many different origins and backgrounds. I think a lot of people think, okay, Mexico. Well, not necessarily. There are people from all over Puerto Rico, Latin American countries, Cuba, the Polynesian islands. And so when we say Hispanic, that covers a huge group. And of course, these people end up being discriminated against. Less education opportunities and more demand for labor from these individuals. Some of the current realities for Hispanic Americans include increasing diversity and rising immigration. They're doing better with infant mortality and life expectancy, and there's more of a variety of occupations that they're able to go into. So that's some of the good news. So people of color in the U.S., if we look at some of the current realities, we have a heterogeneous group, the Asian Americans, and this includes the Chinese and Japanese immigrants. A lot of people in your textbook refers to them as the model minority. And why is that? Well, they still have a higher risk of poverty, but they also have a higher life expectancy. They have a higher median income than other people of color, and they have a lower infant mortality. So that's the good news. Let's talk a little bit about unpacking the backpack of privilege. I think this is a very, very interesting concept. I first learned about it in graduate school. And the whole point is think of yourself going through life, and you get up in the morning, and every morning you're handed a backpack, okay? So what is in that backpack? Tools to help you get through the day, all right? So if you are a white person, you have more tools in that backpack than people of color. And I just think this is a great visual to really understand where people of color are coming from. So if you read that, the paper that I published in your module for this week, one of the things that you'll see is, what is it that you have that's privileged as a person that's part of the majority? I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. Well, a person of color might not feel that way in Winnemucca, Nevada. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area that I can afford in which I would want to live. When I lived in East Cleveland, this wasn't the case for my my African American friends. They could live in the inner city of East Cleveland and feel like they were surrounded by people of their race, but not if they moved out into the suburbs, or not if they moved into a small town. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. And I live in Las Vegas now, and I hope that my neighbors who are people of color know that I'm accepting of them, but I don't think that it's not always the case. Even in even in 2020, it's not always the case. So I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. So right now, people are wearing masks when they go out. There's been talk about how if a black person wears a mask, they might appear more threatening than if a white person does. I had an experience. I want to share this with you. I'll let you go through that paper on your own. It's really interesting, though. Please go through it and recognize what your privileges are and what they are not. But I want to share a story with you, something that happened on UNR campus last year. I went over to University of Nevada, Reno, to collaborate with some of my colleagues over there to learn more about the 3+1 program so I could bring better quality of education to you, my students. While I was there, I sat in on several classes on campus. One of the classes that I sat in on was for this class, and the discussion was about this topic, the backpack of privilege. It was very, very interesting. In the course of the discussion, an African-American man raised his hand and made a comment about how difficult it was, how he didn't always feel like he was able to get a fair shake, especially in terms of if he were pulled over in traffic or something like that. He felt like he was unfairly targeted because of his race. Well, a Caucasian female raised her hand and she said, I just don't think that's right. I think most people that I know, if they did something wrong, then they end up having the consequences for doing something wrong, and it's not about color. I don't think that's right. And it was really interesting because another African-American man, I had a hard time not raising my hand and going, girl, check your backpack of privilege, But another African-American man raised his hand, and I'm so glad. He did it in such a cool, appropriate way. He raised his hand, and with a lot of respect, he said, let me just tell you about me and my situation. I have a teenage son who is autistic. We are African American. We are people of color. Sometimes my teenage son ends up losing it. He ends up having a meltdown. And if you know anything about autism, you know that means he might yell, he might scream, he might throw a tantrum. And that gets harder as teenage boys get older, when autistic traits can be off the charts. And so he said, when my son has a meltdown, I've had Child Protective Services called on me a number of times. My white neighbors think that there's something, really sketchy about my son and what's going on, when in reality I'm just doing my thing. And every time Child Protective Services comes over, I have to say, look, I'm dealing with my autistic child the best I can. And I really hope that this Caucasian woman who spoke recognized, if you were a white lady dealing with an autistic boy who was white, it would be a very different experience for you, wouldn't it? And I don't know, that really just taught me a lot. And I recognize, boy, the white part of me has a whole lot of privilege. And anyway, it's very interesting. The readings that you have this week are very, very interesting. Please give me a call, text, or email if you have any questions. I'm going to, on the website, I've listed, the Facebook page for social work for GBC, I have listed several books that I've been reading about this topic. And I want to challenge you guys, if you have downtime. I know you're really busy right now, but when summer comes, I hope you'll do some of this elective reading so that you can just better prepare yourself. And for those of you who are of a minority race, this is good reading for you too, to better understand where you're coming from, where the attitudes of your people come from. Your predecessors, your parents and grandparents have a right to be heard and to be validated for the challenging situations that they've been put in. And those of us who are social workers, we have not just a responsibility, but a right to stand up for these individuals who are more vulnerable. So good luck with with all your studies this week. Don't hesitate to call, text, or email if you have any questions.